Here it is, the palace nobody remembers. Whitemarsh Hall, Wyndmoor, Pennsylvania. The third largest private residence ever built in America, bigger than any house standing today, larger than the White House. 100,000 square feet, 147 rooms, 50-foot limestone columns that still stand like tombstones, marking where something magnificent used to breathe. Built in 1921, demolished in 1980. 59 years. That's all it lasted. Less than a human lifetime, less than most oak trees. A palace that cost $83 million in construction and untold millions more in furnishings. Erased, reduced to powder, turned into townhouses you can buy for $400,000 today. You see those columns at the corner of Douglas Road and East Willow Grove Avenue? 4 giants, 50 feet tall, holding up nothing. Monuments to absence. Reminders that Americans built Versailles and then smashed it with bulldozers because nobody wanted to pay the electric bill. But the demolition isn't the darkest part. The darkest part is why it was built. Edward T. Stotesbury, partner of J.P. Morgan, senior banker at Drexel and Company, one of the 5 richest men in America with $100 million in 1910. That's $3.1 billion today. Not rich, rich. He didn't build Whitemarsh Hall because he needed a house. He already had 3. A massive townhouse in Philadelphia, an 80-room cottage in Bar Harbor, Maine, a custom 37-room winter palace in Palm Beach. He built Whitemarsh Hall because his second wife, Eva, wanted to prove something, that she belonged, that a widow who had gambled away her first husband's fortune and married for money deserved to be mentioned in the same breath as Vanderbilts and Astors and Rockefellers. So Edward, besotted and 60 years old, bought 300 acres and hired Horace Trumbauer, the architect of choice for every millionaire who wanted to cosplay as European aristocracy, to build America's answer to Versailles. 147 rooms, 45 bathrooms with gold-plated dolphin faucets, a ballroom that was 64 feet long, a pipe organ that rose 3 stories and could be heard in every corner of the mansion, 70 full-time gardeners to maintain grounds that rivaled anything at French royal estates, 40 indoor staff who followed the Stotesburys as they migrated between their 4 mansions like migratory birds following seasons. $1 million per year just to keep it running, just utilities, staff, maintenance, before entertaining, before buying new art, before hosting parties where champagne flowed during Prohibition and French prime ministers declared it America's Versailles. And here's what makes Whitemarsh Hall different from Biltmore or the Vanderbilt mansions or Hearst Castle. Those places had some justification, some purpose beyond pure ego. Biltmore was experiment in forestry and agriculture. Vanderbilt mansions were social headquarters for families that actually shaped American industry. Hearst Castle was eccentric billionaires' art collection. Whitemarsh Hall was built for parties. That's it. 300 acres, 147 rooms, $83 million, so Eva Stotesbury could throw better parties than her rivals, so she could out-opulent women who whispered that she was a gold digger who trapped elderly banker. They used Whitemarsh Hall for 9 years of serious entertaining, 1921 to 1930. 9 years of lavish balls and receptions that newspaper society pages covered breathlessly. And then the Great Depression arrived. Suddenly, throwing million-dollar parties while the country starved wasn't good PR. Publicly criticizing the Stotesburys for living in splendor while America suffered became acceptable, fashionable even. The parties slowed, then stopped. The mansion that existed only to impress people they barely knew became prison they couldn't escape. Edward died in 1938, Iva discovered she was broke. Not actually broke, she still had millions, but broke relative to maintaining 4 massive estates. Broke in the way that people who spend $1 million per year on one house become when markets collapse. She tried to sell Whitemarsh Hall immediately. Nobody wanted it. Who would buy a house that cost more to operate annually than most people earned in lifetimes? Who needed 147 rooms when servants were increasingly demanding fair wages and reasonable hours? Who wanted responsibility of maintaining something so massive it required its own full-time staff just to keep pipes from freezing? The mansion sat empty through most of World War II. Its only use? Warehouse for Metropolitan Museum of Art treasures evacuated from Manhattan because officials feared German U-boats might bombard the city. Imagine that. Greatest private residence in America, built for parties, used to hide paintings because its only value was space nobody wanted. In 1943, Iva finally found buyer. Pennsylvania Salt Manufacturing Company, PennSalt, paid $167,000. Read that again. $167,000 for property that cost $83 million to build 22 years earlier. A 99.8% loss. PennSalt turned ballrooms into laboratories, converted bedrooms into research spaces, installed modern equipment in rooms designed for Renaissance furniture and old master paintings. It worked for 20 years. Then PennSalt moved to newer facilities and sold the property. And then Whitemarsh Hall entered final circle of hell reserved for Gilded Age mansions nobody wants. A succession of real estate investors bought it, tried to figure out what to do with it, failed, let it decay, sold it to next speculator who promised grand vision and delivered nothing. By 1970, the mansion was gutted, vandalized, stripped. Drug dealers operated in former ballroom. Teenagers threw parties in rooms where prime ministers once dined. The estate became a liability and hazard and embarrassment. Local officials debated, preservationists begged, developers proposed everything from luxury apartments to complete restoration. Nothing worked because fundamental equation never changed. Whitemarsh Hall cost more to maintain than anyone could earn from it. It was too big to repurpose, too expensive to preserve, too iconic to ignore, but too impractical to save. In 1980, 59 years after completion, wrecking crews moved in. They demolished the third largest private residence ever built in America. They reduced 100,000 square feet of Georgian splendor to rubble. They turned ballroom where prime ministers waltzed into chunks of limestone. They crushed marble fireplaces that had cost more than most houses. The demolition crews wore T-shirts printed with Stotesbury mansion and image of a wrecking ball. Souvenir shirts, like they'd won a championship. We demolished Versailles, collector's edition. On the rubble, they built townhouses, 163 units, Stotesbury Estates, named after the mansion they'd just erased. You can buy one today. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, maybe $400,000. Built on ground where servants once slept in quarters more luxurious than most Americans' homes. Only 4 things survived. The 50-foot columns at the main entrance, left standing as ruins, decorative remnants for a subdivision that profits from ghost of grandeur it replaced. A stone gatehouse, now single-family home. 1 belvedere, garden structure that once offered views of manicured grounds stretching to horizon. A few headless statues, decapitated by vandals in the 1970s, standing among townhouses like shell-shocked survivors of architectural genocide. That's what remains of $83 million palace, of $1 million per year operating budget, of Edward Stotesbury's love for Eva, of Eva's desperate need to prove she belonged. 4 columns, a gatehouse, 1 belvedere, headless statues, and a question that nobody asks but everybody should. If we built it once,
Why did we destroy it? And what does it say about us that we turned palace into powder and called it progress? If you enjoy investigations into how America's wealthiest families built monuments to ego and then abandoned them when maintenance exceeded ambition, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have tried to save Whitemarsh Hall, or were they right to demolish it? Your support makes possible these deep dives into forgotten architecture that reveals uncomfortable truths about American greed, ambition, and the cost of keeping up appearances. Because Whitemarsh Hall isn't just a story of one mansion, it's the story of an entire class of Americans who confused size with significance, who built as if resources were infinite, who created beauty they couldn't sustain and then blamed changing times when reality arrived with demolition permit. And the saddest part? We forgot it almost immediately. Ask random person on street about great American mansions. They'll name Biltmore, maybe Hearst Castle, perhaps Vanderbilt Mansion in Newport. Nobody remembers Whitemarsh Hall, because in America, even palaces are disposable when the bills come due. Chapter 1. The Banker and the Widow. Edward Townsend Stotesbury was 58 years old, recently widowed after 36 years of marriage, senior partner at Drexel & Company, the Philadelphia banking house with direct ties to J.P. Morgan's New York empire. Ned to his friends, the man who knows more about the details of banking than anyone in the United States, according to Morgan himself. He wasn't just rich, he was invisibly, powerfully, institutionally wealthy, the kind of wealth that doesn't make headlines because it controls the institutions that make headlines. $100 million in 1910, adjusted for inflation, that's $3.1 billion today. But simple inflation adjustment doesn't capture real scale. In 1910, $100 million could buy entire industries, could finance wars, could reshape American economy through decisions made in private clubs and bankroom boardrooms. Stotesbury had survived Panic of 1907, the financial crisis that nearly destroyed American banking system, with fortune not just intact but enhanced. While smaller banks collapsed and lesser financiers jumped from windows, Stotesbury and Morgan had quietly bought assets at pennies on the dollar and emerged richer. He collected 18th-century European portraits. His collection ranked among the top 3 in America, alongside Henry Clay and Henry Huntington. Rooms in his Philadelphia townhouse were already museum quality before he met the woman who would change everything.
Enter Eva Roberts Cromwell, recently widowed herself, 42 years old to Stotesbury's 58, beautiful in cultivated, maintained way that required resources, socially ambitious in manner that made old money families uncomfortable. Her first husband, Oliver Eaton Cromwell, had left her comfortable but not secure, and Eva, perhaps unwisely, had played stock market with inheritance, lost most of it. Standard story of Gilded Age widow who discovered too late that her lifestyle required either new fortune or new husband. She found both in Edward Stotesbury. They met at social function in Washington, D.C. Eva was charming, well-dressed, excellent at conversation that made wealthy men feel interesting. She had 2 children from first marriage, Jimmy and Louise, adults by this point but still dependent on her. Stotesbury was enchanted, not swept away in romantic sense. Stotesbury was banker. He calculated everything. But he calculated that Eva would be excellent addition to his life. She understood society in ways his first wife, lovely woman but Philadelphia old money who never needed to try, had not. Eva would open doors, would know how to navigate Newport society and Palm Beach season, an international social circuit, would understand that wealth at Stotesbury's level required performance, not just possession.
They married in June 1912 in Washington, D.C. The wedding was spectacle. Newspapers called it more opulent than royal wedding. Gift table looked like Aladdin's grotto of precious metals and priceless gems. Edward's wedding gift to Eva, pearl necklace worth $500,000, almost $15 million in today's money, for necklace. Message was clear. Edward Stotesbury had resources to support Eva's social ambitions, and Eva understood her role was to spend those resources in ways that enhanced Stotesbury's position. It was transaction, not cynical. Both parties genuinely liked each other, but transaction nonetheless. Eva got security and social position. Edward got companion, who understood that banking power required social performance. They had properties already, the Philadelphia townhouse off Rittenhouse Square, actually two townhouses that Stotesbury had combined into one massive residence. Impressive, but city property, constrained by neighbors and street grid. They needed more space, more visibility, more capacity to entertain on a scale that matched Stotesbury's financial position. So they bought second home, Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, Maine, 80 rooms, summer retreat where Philadelphia's elite escaped heat and humidity, where social competition continued in supposedly casual environment. Then third home, El Mirasol in Palm Beach, Florida, 37 custom rooms, Winker Palace where America's wealthiest families congregated to avoid northeastern cold and enjoy newly fashionable Florida coast. 3 massive properties, Philadelphia for fall and spring, Bar Harbor for summer, Palm Beach for winter. Comfortable migration pattern following seasons and social calendar. But Eva wanted something more. She watched Vanderbilts building Marble House and the Breakers in Newport, saw how Biltmore made George Vanderbilt respectable despite being youngest son without railroad empire. Noticed that truly great families had country estates, massive properties set in hundreds of acres where they could control the entire landscape. Eva wanted a palace, not city mansion constrained by lot lines, not summer cottage, however large, but genuine palace with grounds that stretched beyond sight, a place that could be called the seat of Stotesbury power. She found her location in 1916. Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, about 15 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Rural but accessible by automobile and train. 300 acres available for purchase. More importantly, elevated site. Hill that commanded views in every direction. Land where a palace could be built that would be visible from miles away. That would dominate landscape the way Stotesbury dominated banking. Eva showed Edward the property, made her case. This would be their spring and fall residence, 6 months per year, place where they could entertain on scale impossible in city or at seasonal homes. Edward agreed, not because he needed another house, but because he calculated that proper country estate was final piece of performance his position required. He purchased 300 acres in Springfield Township, and hired Horace Trumbauer to design the greatest private residence in America, the commission that would define both their legacies and eventually destroy them. Chapter 2. The Architect of Excess. Horace Trumbauer. If you're building palace in early 20th century America, his name is at top of a very short list. Born 1868 in Philadelphia, son of druggist, no family wealth, no inherited position, just extraordinary talent for design and acute understanding of what rich people wanted. He started as an apprentice to architect at age 16. By 23 had owned practice. By 30 was go-to architect for Philadelphia's wealthiest families. His specialty? Beaux Arts interpretation of European grandeur, French chateaux and English country houses and Italian palazzos, all reimagined for American millionaires who wanted pedigree without actual ancestors. Trumbauer understood fundamental truth about Gilded Age wealth. New money wanted to look like old money, and since America had no aristocratic architectural tradition, wealthy Americans would buy European architectural traditions wholesale. He gave them exactly what they wanted. Linwood Hall for Peter A. B. Widener, one of largest houses in Philadelphia area. French Renaissance chateau that made visitors feel they'd been transported to the Loire Valley. The Philadelphia Museum of Art. Yes, that Philadelphia Museum of Art, the iconic building Rocky runs up steps of. Trumbauer designed it. Beaux Arts temple that announces culture with capital C. Whitemarsh Hall would be his masterpiece, his chance to design without significant constraint, because Edward Stotesbury wasn't asking for a house, he was asking for a palace that would define American grandeur. And Eva was asking for something more specific. She wanted to out-Vanderbilt the Vanderbilts, wanted property that would make Marble House look merely adequate and the breakers seem almost modest, wanted European visitors to see Whitemarsh Hall and revise their assumptions about American taste. Trumbauer accepted commission in 1916. He spent months designing, revising, consulting with Eva about every detail. She wasn't a passive client. She had opinions about room layout, about sightlines, about how spaces would function during entertaining. This wasn't Edward's house. It was Eva's. Edward was financing. Eva was directing. The design Trumbauer produced was extraordinary even by his standards. Georgian Revival exterior, Neo-Palladian proportions, inspired by great English country houses like Wentworth Woodhouse and Blenheim Palace, but scaled up, Americanized, given resources that no British aristocrat could match because British aristocrats were landed gentry constrained by inheritance. Stotesbury was banker with liquid wealth. U-shaped floor plan, 6 stories, 3 above ground, 3 partially or fully underground. Central block with 2 wings extending back. Design that created interior courtyard and maximized southern exposure for primary rooms. 100,000 square feet, 147 rooms, 45 bathrooms, 64-foot ballroom, gymnasium, movie theater, refrigeration plant. Remember, residential refrigeration barely existed in 1916. Whitemarsh would have industrial-scale cold storage. Pipe organ rising 3 stories, visible from multiple floors through clever architectural voids, because Eva Stotesbury loved organ music and insisted it should be heard throughout house. The entrance would be marked by porticos supported by 4 massive limestone columns, each 50 feet tall, carved from single pieces of Indiana limestone. Transporting them to site would require custom rail cars and crews specialized in moving objects that weighed dozens of tons. Every detail specified, every material chosen for maximum impact. Marble from Italy, hardwoods from Central and South America, gilt from specialized craftsmen, plasterwork that required artisans trained in European techniques. This wasn't construction, it was manufacturing palace using industrial-age supply chains and global sourcing. Trumbauer estimated construction would take 3 to 4 years. Budget was effectively unlimited. Stotesbury had told him to build something magnificent. Cost was secondary concern. Construction began in 1916 and immediately ran into problem nobody anticipated. World War I. Chapter 3. Building During Apocalypse. April 1917. America entered World War I. Construction of Whitemarsh Hall was barely underway. Foundation work mostly complete, some structural steel erected, but mansion was still mostly blueprints and ambition. The war changed everything. Materials became scarce, steel prioritized for military production, lumber redirected to build training camps and ammunition factories. Specialized craftsmen enlisted or took higher-paying factory work producing weapons. Shipping from Europe, source of marble, specialized hardware, decorative elements, became unreliable and expensive. German U-boats made Atlantic crossing dangerous. Insurance rates for cargo skyrocketed. Labor costs increased dramatically. Workers who remained available demanded premium wages because demand exceeded supply. Normal circumstances, project would halt, wait for war to end, resume when conditions normalized. But Eva Stotesbury refused to wait. She had a vision, had a timeline, had a social calendar that required Whitemarsh Hall to be ready for 1920 summer season. Delay was unacceptable, so Stotesbury paid, whatever it took. Premium prices for materials, premium wages for labor, premium fees to source specialized items from neutral countries when European sources were unavailable. The war that was destroying millions of lives actually helped Stotesbury. Banking firms like Drexel profited enormously from war financing, lending money to allied governments, underwriting bond issues, facilitating massive capital flows required by industrial warfare. While American soldiers died in France, Stotesbury's fortune grew, and a fraction of that fortune flowed directly into Whitemarsh Hall construction. It was obscene, but the Gilded Age was fundamentally obscene. That was the point. Construction continued through 1918, through the armistice in November, into 1919 as America demobilized and attempted to return to normalcy. Jacques Breber, renowned French landscape architect who had designed gardens for the French government, was brought over to design the grounds. His vision: informal English parkland combined with formal French gardens. Acres of carefully controlled nature that would look spontaneous while requiring 70 full-time gardeners to maintain. The landscaping alone cost more than most houses. Massive terraces, water features, statuary imported from Italy, garden walls, belvederes positioned at points of scenic interest, trees transplanted fully grown because waiting for saplings to mature was unthinkable. Inside, Sir Charles Allom directed decorating. Allom was legendary. He decorated Buckingham Palace for British royal family. His role at Whitemarsh was ensuring every room achieved coherent magnificence. Furniture sourced primarily from Europe, antiques authenticated by Joseph Devine, most powerful art dealer of era. Devine was man who convinced American millionaires that European culture was worth price of admission. His commissions on sales to Whitemarsh alone could sustain a comfortable lifestyle. Paintings acquired methodically. Stotesbury already had major collection, but Whitemarsh required more. Portraits for galleries, landscapes for drawing rooms, old masters for library. Everything curated, everything authenticated, everything expensive. The cost estimate had been $10 million for construction. By completion in 1921, actual cost was closer to $83 million, including land acquisition, construction, decorating, landscaping, and initial furnishing. Adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $1.3 billion today. For house. Compare, White House underwent complete renovation in early 1950s that gutted and rebuilt entire interior. Cost was $5.7 million, about $70 million in current dollars. Whitemarsh Hall cost nearly 20 times more than completely rebuilding White House. And was larger, 100,000 square feet versus White House's 55,000. Which means Whitemarsh Hall, when completed in 1921, was literally largest, most expensive private residence in America. Edward and Eva Stotesbury stood in completed vestibule in spring 1921 and surveyed what they had created. 50-foot columns outside, marble entrance hall inside, 3-story pipe organ visible through architectural void, ballroom stretching 64 feet, 45 bathrooms with gold dolphin faucets, 147 rooms waiting to be filled with life and parties and performance of wealth. It was everything Eva had demanded, everything Trumbauer had promised, everything American grandeur could possibly mean in an era before income tax made such excess unsustainable. One newspaper called it a veritable showplace, another declared it a marvel of beauty and completeness. The French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, visited and called it America's Versailles. Henry Ford, whose fortune exceeded Stotesbury's, toured the property and commented, "It's a great experience to see how the rich live." Even millionaires were impressed. Eva had achieved her goal. She had built a palace that made Vanderbilt mansions look restrained, that proved she belonged among America's premier families, that established Stotesbury name alongside Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Astor. For 9 years, it worked exactly as intended. Whitemarsh Hall hosted balls and receptions on a scale that made society pages. Guests arrived by automobile and private rail car. They wandered gardens that rivaled Versailles. They danced in ballroom while an orchestra played from an elevated balcony. They drank champagne during Prohibition from stores hidden in secret rooms. Eva was happy. Edward was satisfied that investment had achieved desired social return. Whitemarsh Hall functioned as a stage for the performance that wealth at that level required. And then, in October 1929, the stage collapsed. The stock market crashed. Chapter 4. The Golden Years, 1921 to 1929. For 9 years, Whitemarsh Hall operated exactly as Eva Stotesbury had envisioned. It was stage, theater, performance space for wealth on scale that few Americans could comprehend. The typical Whitemarsh season ran from April through June, then September through November. 6 months, spring and fall, when Pennsylvania weather was perfect and social calendar demanded proximity to Philadelphia. Eva spent the other 6 months migrating between their other properties, July-August at Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, December-March at El Mirasol in Palm Beach, brief stops at Philadelphia Townhouse for business meetings Edward needed to attend. But Whitemarsh was centerpiece, the property that mattered most, the palace that proved Eva Stotesbury belonged. The entertaining was relentless. Weekend house parties where 20 to 40 guests arrived Friday afternoon and departed Monday morning. Entire weekends choreographed like military campaigns. Friday evening cocktails, Saturday afternoon garden tours, Saturday evening formal dinner followed by dancing in ballroom. Sunday morning breakfast on terraces, Sunday afternoon tea. Guests occupied the 40 guest bedrooms, each with private bathroom, each decorated in different style: French Provincial, English Regency, Italian Renaissance, American Colonial. Every room themed, every detail considered. Staff ratios were absurd: 40 indoor servants during high season, 70 gardeners maintaining grounds, additional temporary staff hired for major events. Ratio of staff to family members was roughly 30-1. The ballroom parties were legendary. Eva would host 4 or 5 major balls per season. Each required months of planning, guest lists carefully curated, mixing old Philadelphia money with new industrial wealth with international aristocracy. Orchestra positioned in balcony overlooking dance floor, champagne flowing from fountains despite Prohibition, food prepared by French chefs brought over specifically for events, flowers covering every surface, thousands of roses, orchids imported from South America, arrangements that cost more than working-class families earned annually. Dress codes were strict, white tie mandatory for major events. Women expected to wear different gowns each evening if staying multiple days. Jewelry competitions were unspoken but fierce, wives of industrialists comparing diamonds and emeralds and sapphires like generals comparing armies. The gardens were attraction unto themselves. 70 gardeners maintained 300 acres of curated landscape. Formal gardens near house transitioned to informal English parkland further out. Specialized gardens for roses, for cutting flowers, for vegetables that supplied house kitchens. Garden parties in June became annual tradition. 300 to 400 guests wandering grounds, orchestras positioned strategically so music floated through the gardens, tea served in multiple locations, Eva playing grand dame, accepting compliments, ensuring every guest felt simultaneously honored to be invited and aware they were in presence of greatness. The pipe organ concerts were Eva's particular pride. She hired professional organists to give private concerts for house guests. The 3-story instrument could be heard throughout the mansion, Baroque compositions echoing through marble halls, Wagner and Bach and Handel performed for audiences of 30 people in ballroom, while most of America had never heard live classical music.
Newspaper society pages covered Whitemarsh events religiously. Every major party received column inches, guest list published, what women wore described in detail. Eva collected clippings in leather-bound scrapbooks. This was validation, proof that Stotesbury name ranked alongside Vanderbilt and Astor. Proof that Eva, former widow who'd gambled away first inheritance, had achieved peak of American society. The costs were staggering, $1 million per year just for basic operations, utilities for 100,000 square feet, heating in winter, cooling in summer, primitive air conditioning supplemented by elaborate system of fans and ice delivery, 70 gardeners, 40 house staff, property taxes, insurance, maintenance. Additional hundreds of thousands for entertainment, musicians, catering for events that required supplemental staff and supplies, flowers, champagne, new furnishings as fashions changed, art acquisitions as Stotesbury's collection expanded. Edward paid without complaint. His fortune was vast enough that even Whitemarsh's consumption barely registered. Drexel and Company was thriving. His investments continued generating returns. The 20s were boom years for anyone positioned correctly in financial markets. And the social return was exactly what he'd calculated. Doors opened, business opportunities materialized, banking connections strengthened, politicians visited and became allies. International financiers toured Whitemarsh and approved massive loans based partly on impression of stability that palace projected. In Gilded Age arithmetic, spending $1 million per year on a house that generated no revenue made perfect sense if it facilitated deals worth tens of millions. Eva was happy. Edward was satisfied. Whitemarsh Hall functioned precisely as intended. For 9 years. And then, in October 1929, everything changed. Chapter 5. Black Thursday. October 24, 1929. Stock market crashed. Not gradually, not with warning that allowed preparation, violently, suddenly, catastrophically. Fortunes evaporated in hours. Banks that seemed solid at breakfast were insolvent by dinner. Brokers jumped from windows. Millionaires became debtors overnight. Edward Stotesbury was 77 years old, senior partner at Drexel, connected to every major financial institution in America, man who'd survived panic of 1907 and emerged richer. But 1929 was different. Scale was unprecedented. Contagion spread faster than anyone could contain. The mechanisms that had protected wealth in previous panics, private bailouts, coordinated responses by banking elite, were overwhelmed. Stotesbury's fortune didn't disappear completely. He wasn't ruined in the classic sense, but it shrunk dramatically. Assets that had been worth $100 million in 1928 were worth fraction by 1930. More importantly, the income-generating capacity vanished. Banking fees collapsed as deal flow evaporated, investment dividends ceased as companies failed, real estate values plummeted.
The $1 million per year required to operate Whitemarsh Hall suddenly felt very different. When your fortune is growing and generating returns that exceed costs, $1 million annual expense is rounding error. When your capital is shrinking and income streams are drying up, $1 million is a hemorrhage.
But you can't just turn off Palace. The fixed costs remain: property taxes, insurance, minimum staff to prevent complete deterioration, heating so pipes don't freeze, basic maintenance so building doesn't start literally falling apart. And there's social calculation. Closing Whitemarsh Hall would signal weakness, would announce to society and, more importantly, to business rivals that Stotesbury fortune was impaired. In a world where perception of wealth matters as much as reality, maintaining appearances was not optional. So they continued, but differently. The parties stopped, or rather became rare instead of constant. Weekend house parties with 40 guests became occasional dinners for 8. Balls ceased entirely, garden parties canceled. Staff was reduced, gradually. 40 indoor servants became 30, then 20. 70 gardeners became 40, then 25. Each reduction meant portions of grounds received less attention, meant rooms stayed closed longer, meant visible decline. But Whitemarsh still consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Just keeping it breathing required fortune. And the Depression wasn't temporary blip, it deepened. 1930, 1931, 1932, each year worse than previous. Banks failing, unemployment rising, entire economy contracting into itself. Public opinion shifted. Suddenly, massive private palaces looked obscene. Newspapers that had fawned over Whitemarsh parties now ran editorials criticizing wealthy families living in splendor while millions starved. Eva felt it personally. She who had courted society pages, who had built palace to impress. Now those same society reporters looked at Whitemarsh differently. It represented excess, waste, insensitivity to national suffering. The Stotesburys became targets, not violently, but socially. They were mentioned in articles about inequality, used as examples of Gilded Age excess that had caused depression, blamed for America's suffering by people looking for villains. Eva stopped entertaining almost entirely, stopped hosting, stopped performing wealth, because performance that had been applauded in 1925 was condemned in 1932. Edward's health deteriorated. Stress of watching fortune shrink, pressure of maintaining multiple massive properties on a reduced income, age catching up. He was approaching 80. By 1935, it was clear Whitemarsh Hall had become burden rather than asset. Edward suggested selling, quietly. Find buyer, take a loss, move on. Eva resisted. This was her creation, her proof that she belonged, her legacy. Selling would be admission of failure. But the market for 100,000 square foot palaces in the middle of depression was approximately zero. Who could afford to buy, and more critically, who could afford to operate? The very wealthy who might have resources were smart enough to recognize liability. Younger generation coming into wealth during 1930s had different values, didn't want massive estates, wanted efficiency, modernity, practicality. So Whitemarsh sat, occupying 300 acres, consuming resources, declining slowly. Monument to an era that had ended but refused to acknowledge its own obsolescence. Edward died in 1938. And Eva discovered exactly how precarious her position had become. Chapter 6: The Widow's Disaster. May 16, 1938. Edward T. Stotesbury died at 86. Complications from bronchial pneumonia, surrounded by family, peaceful as these things go. His obituaries were respectful, noted his banking career, his partnership with Morgan, his role in financing American industry, his art collection, his philanthropy. They mentioned Whitemarsh Hall as one of his notable achievements. Quote,
One of the finest estates in America, one paper called it. But the estate settlement revealed uncomfortable reality. Edward's fortune, while still substantial, was fraction of what it had been. The 1929 crash, the Depression, bad investments, age-related decline in active banking income, maintenance costs of 4 massive properties. He left Eva wealthy, but not wealthy enough. She inherited the properties: Philadelphia Townhouse, Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, El Mirasol in Palm Beach, Whitemarsh Hall. She inherited investment portfolio, stocks and bonds and real estate holdings, sufficient to generate comfortable income for normal lifestyle. But comfortable income and can operate 4 massive estates are different categories. Eva did math, brutal arithmetic. Cost to operate properties exceeded income they generated by orders of magnitude. She could maintain lifestyle for a few years, maybe decade if she was careful, but trajectory was clear: slow bleeding of capital until she was actually broke. She made decision immediately: sell Whitemarsh Hall. It hurt. This was her masterpiece, her palace. But Eva was pragmatic beneath social ambitions. She understood when game was over. She contacted real estate agents, put property on market, asked $1.5 million, fraction of construction cost, but still substantial sum. No offers. Lowered price to $1 million. Nothing. $750,000. Silence. The problem was fundamental. Whitemarsh Hall required buyers who had both resources to purchase and resources to operate. That pool was extremely small, and those few people wealthy enough were smart enough to calculate that buying Whitemarsh meant committing to million-dollar annual expenses in perpetuity. Why buy a liability? Eva tried different approaches, suggested property could be converted to a luxury hotel, to a country club, to an institutional use, college or hospital or government facility. Each suggestion foundered on the same issue: scale was too large, cost too high, location not ideal for commercial purpose. Repurposing would require additional millions of investment. Through 1939 and 1940, Whitemarsh Hall sat, listed for sale, slowly declining. Eva couldn't maintain it properly, didn't have the resources, but couldn't abandon it, still hoped for buyer. Staff was reduced to a skeleton crew, 5 people maintaining 100,000 square feet. Gardens went wild, rooms accumulated dust, systems began failing from lack of maintenance. Then World War II began, and suddenly Eva had a buyer. Sort of. Metropolitan Museum of Art needed emergency storage for treasures they were evacuating from Manhattan. Fear that German U-boats might bombard New York, that bombs might fall on the museum, that irreplaceable art might be destroyed. They approached Eva. Could they rent Whitemarsh Hall as storage, temporarily, just for the duration of the war? They'd pay. Not much, this was an emergency after all, but they'd pay. Eva agreed, not because the rent was significant, but because it solved immediate problem. Someone else would be responsible for property. Someone else would keep it heated and secured. Someone else would ensure it didn't completely deteriorate. Paintings and sculptures worth hundreds of millions of dollars were carefully packed and transported to Whitemarsh Hall. Ballroom became storage vault, guest bedrooms became climate-controlled archives, palace built for parties became a warehouse for art fleeing war. The irony was perfect. Whitemarsh Hall, which existed to display wealth, ended up hiding other people's treasures. When war ended in 1945, the Metropolitan Museum of Art retrieved their art, thanked Eva, left. And Whitemarsh was empty again. Listed for sale, deteriorating faster now. 4 years of minimal maintenance had accelerated decay. Eva was desperate. She'd already sold Wingwood House in Bar Harbor, had dramatically reduced operations at El Mirasol, was living off capital that continued shrinking. In 1946, she lowered asking price to $350,000. Finally, in 1943, records are conflicting. Pensalt Manufacturing Company, Pensalt, made an offer, $167,000. Read that again, $167,000 for property that cost $83 million to build 27 years earlier. It was an insult, humiliation, but Eva had no leverage. No other buyers existed. The property was bleeding her dry, declining rapidly. Every year she kept it meant more capital consumed. She accepted. On September 24, 1943, Whitemarsh Hall transferred to Pensalt for $167,000. Eva moved to El Mirasol in Palm Beach permanently, would live there until her death in 1946. She never returned to Whitemarsh, never wanted to see what became of her palace. The newspapers noted the sale with brief articles, Stotesbury Mansion sold. No fanfare, no nostalgia, just transaction recorded because Stotesbury name still meant something. Eva Stotesbury, who'd built Versailles in Pennsylvania to prove she belonged, died 3 years later, knowing she'd sold her masterpiece for 0.2% of construction cost. She was 78, had lived in a Philadelphia townhouse and Bar Harbor mansion and Palm Beach Palace and Whitemarsh Hall, had thrown parties that made society pages, had achieved social position she'd craved, and died having outlived the era that made any of it matter. Her obituaries were kind, noted her philanthropy, her entertaining, her place in Philadelphia society. None mentioned she'd spent final years of life selling off palaces for pennies because maintaining them was impossible. That part was too depressing to print. Chapter 7. The Laboratory. Pensalt didn't buy Whitemarsh Hall for its ballroom. They bought it for space, cheap space, 100,000 square feet for $167,000 was bargain compared to building equivalent research facility from scratch. The transformation began immediately. Ballroom, where Eva had hosted 500 guests, became main laboratory. Floor reinforced to handle heavy equipment, walls modified to accommodate ventilation systems, chandeliers removed and sold, parquet floors covered with industrial tile. Guest bedrooms became smaller labs, offices, storage, each room converted to functional space. Elaborate decorations stripped, plasterwork painted over, marble fireplaces removed and sold to architectural salvage. The gardens were abandoned. 70 gardeners reduced to 2 groundskeepers who mowed occasionally and did basic maintenance. 300 acres of curated landscape began reverting to nature. But the building worked for Pensalt's purposes. The scale was actually advantage. They could centralize operations, have research, development, administration all in one location. Parking lots replaced terraces, loading docks replaced garden walls. For 20 years, Pensalt operated successfully at Whitemarsh Hall, developed chemicals and industrial processes, employed hundreds. The property had purpose, even if that purpose bore no relationship to original intention. Then, in 1960s, Pensalt built modern facility elsewhere. New laboratory designed specifically for their needs, better ventilation, more efficient layout, modern infrastructure. They didn't need Whitemarsh anymore. In 1968, they sold it, and thus began final chapter, the decline that would end in demolition. Chapter 8. The Decay. Between 1968 and 1980, Whitemarsh Hall changed hands multiple times. Each owner had a vision. None succeeded. First buyer proposed luxury apartments, converting the mansion into high-end residences. Architects drew plans, estimated costs, realized renovation would cost more than building new construction, abandoned project. Second buyer suggested restaurant and event venue. Ballroom could host weddings, guest rooms could be dining areas, gardens could be outdoor reception spaces. Started minor renovations, ran out of money, walked away. Third buyer was a speculator. Bought cheap, planned to flip quickly, found no buyers, let property sit while debating options. During this period, the building began seriously deteriorating. Vandalism started almost immediately after Pensalt left. Windows broken, graffiti sprayed on walls, copper plumbing stripped and sold for scrap, decorative elements stolen, light fixtures, doorknobs, ornamental metalwork. Teenagers discovered it, perfect place for parties, massive abandoned mansion where no authority monitored. They broke in regularly, drank, did drugs, destroyed what remained of the interior.
Drug dealers set up operations in former ballroom. Convenient location, large space, impossible to police. Local authorities knew but lacked resources to properly secure property. The building began literally falling apart. Roof leaked in multiple places, water damaged plasterwork, froze in winter and cracked pipes, accelerated deterioration. By 1975, portions of mansion were structurally unsound. Ceilings collapsed in some rooms, floors rotted through in others. The magnificent staircase that had welcomed prime ministers was missing sections. Preservationists rallied. Local historical societies begged someone to save it. Newspapers ran articles about tragic loss of architectural heritage. Architecture students did measured drawings, trying to document what remained. But reality remained unchanged. No individual or institution could afford to restore it. Estimates for full restoration ranged from $30 million to $50 million. Then ongoing million-dollar annual operating costs. Who would pay that? For what purpose? As museum? Who would visit museum in suburban Pennsylvania? As private residence? Who wanted 100,000 square feet in an age when even wealthy people valued efficiency over ostentation? The final owner, a real estate development company, tried one last option. Submitted plans to local zoning board, proposed demolishing mansion, building residential subdivision on property, 163 townhouses, Stotesbury estates. Preservationists fought, filed petitions, argued mansion was historical landmark, should be preserved regardless of cost. Zoning board was sympathetic but practical. Building was dangerous, attracted crime, was environmental hazard, asbestos, lead paint, deteriorating materials. Restoration costs were prohibitive. No viable alternative use existed. In 1979, board approved demolition permit. Last-ditch efforts to save structure failed. No buyer emerged with resources. No government agency would assume responsibility. In 1980, 59 years after completion, demolition began. Chapter 9. The Wrecking. Wrecking crews arrived in spring 1980. They wore T-shirts printed with Stotesbury Mansion and image of a wrecking ball, souvenir shirts, like commemorating championship season. The destruction took months. You don't quickly dismantle 100,000 square feet of stone and steel and marble. They started with the interior, stripping remaining elements that had value, wooden paneling, marble mantels, decorative plasterwork, anything that could be salvaged and sold. Then structural demolition, wrecking balls smashing through walls, machinery tearing down floors. Stone by stone, room by room, the palace came down. Pieces of Whitemarsh Hall were scattered. Architectural salvage dealers bought elements and resold them.
Marble fireplaces ended up in homes across Pennsylvania. Decorative panels became features in restaurants. Fragments of Eva Stotesbury's palace distributed randomly across the region. The limestone was crushed, used as fill. Ballroom where prime ministers danced became gravel under parking lots and highways. Local residents came to watch, stood at property boundaries observing destruction. Some were sad, loss of landmark. Others were satisfied, good riddance to monument of excess. Newspapers covered demolition with brief articles. Historic mansion demolished. Preservationists quoted expressing regret. Developers quoted defending decision as economically necessary. No major national coverage. By 1980, American attention had moved on. Whitemarsh Hall was forgotten except by local residents and architecture historians. The demolition crews left four things standing. The 50-foot entrance columns. Developer decided they'd be interesting feature for subdivision. Ruins that would give townhouses historic character. The gatehouse, converted to single-family residence, sold separately. One belvedere, garden structure that somehow survived neglect, too expensive to demolish for little benefit. Few headless statues. Vandals had decapitated them in 1970s, too damaged to sell, too heavy to easily remove, left standing among townhouses like shell-shocked survivors. That's what remains of Whitemarsh Hall today. 4 columns holding up nothing, gatehouse, belvedere, headless statues, and 163 townhouses where a palace used to stand. You can buy one. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, around $400,000, built on ground where 70 gardeners once maintained paradise, where Eva Stotesbury hosted prime ministers, where Edward Stotesbury proved banking wealth could rival aristocratic heritage. The townhouses have amenities, central air, modern kitchens, 2-car garages, everything current homeowner wants. They're comfortable, practical, efficient. Everything Whitemarsh Hall was not. Chapter 10. The Survivors. Why do some Gilded Age mansions survive while Whitemarsh Hall became rubble? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about American values, economic sustainability, and what we actually choose to preserve versus what we claim to value. Let's examine the survivors. Biltmore Estate, still standing, still operating, 1 million visitors annually, revenue of $300 million per year from tourism, winery, hotels, and events. Built by George Vanderbilt, completed 1895, 250 rooms on 8,000 acres in Asheville, North Carolina. Why did Biltmore survive? George Vanderbilt had vision beyond parties. He hired Gifford Pinchot to create America's first managed forest, established agricultural experiments, built working dairy, created infrastructure that could generate revenue independent of family fortune. When George died in 1914, wife Edith opened portions to public during Great Depression, charged admission, used revenue for maintenance. When William Cecil, George's grandson, took over in 1960, he transformed Biltmore into full tourist attraction, added winery in 1985, built in on Biltmore Estate in 2001. Biltmore survived because family adapted, transformed private palace into public business, accepted that maintaining such property required revenue streams beyond inherited wealth. The Breakers Newport, still standing, operated by Preservation Society of Newport County, 300,000 visitors annually. Built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, completed 1895, 70 rooms on 13 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The Breakers survived because Vanderbilt family donated it to Preservation Society in 1948, recognized they couldn't maintain it privately, made pragmatic decision to preserve it as a museum rather than let it decay. Family retained living quarters on 3rd floor until 2018, but ground floor was public museum since 1948. Revenue from admissions funded preservation. Hearst Castle, California, still standing. State of California operates it, about 750,000 visitors annually before COVID. Built by William Randolph Hearst, construction 1919 to 1947, never fully completed. 165 rooms on 250,000 acres. Hearst Castle survived because in 1957, Hearst Corporation donated it to State of California, became State Historic Park. Government assumed maintenance responsibility, admission fees fund operations with state budgets supplementing shortfalls. Pattern emerges. Surviving Gilded Age mansions shared characteristics Whitemarsh Hall lacked: family commitment across generations to adapt, conversion to revenue-generating operation, transfer to institution capable of sustaining costs, location that attracts sufficient tourism, unique features that justify preservation expense. Whitemarsh Hall failed on multiple criteria. Edward and Eva Stotesbury had no children together. Eva's children from her first marriage had no emotional attachment to the property that consumed her mother's fortune. No next generation existed to fight for preservation. Chapter 10. The Survivors. Why do some Gilded Age mansions survive while Whitemarsh Hall became rubble? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about American values, economic sustainability, and what we actually choose to preserve versus what we claim to value. Let's examine the survivors. Biltmore Estate, still standing, still operating, 1 million visitors annually. Revenue of $300 million per year from tourism, winery, hotels, and events. Built by George Vanderbilt, completed 1895, 250 rooms on 8,000 acres in Asheville, North Carolina. Why did Biltmore survive? George Vanderbilt had vision beyond parties. He hired Gifford Pinchot to create America's first managed forest, established agricultural experiments, built working dairy, created infrastructure that could generate revenue independent of family fortune. When George died in 1914, wife Edith opened portions to public during Great Depression, charged admission, used revenue for maintenance. When William Cecil, George's grandson, took over in 1960, he transformed Biltmore into full tourist attraction, added winery in 1985, built in on Biltmore Estate in 2001. Biltmore survived because family adapted, transformed private palace into public business, accepted that maintaining such property required revenue streams beyond inherited wealth. The Breakers Newport, still standing, operated by Preservation Society of Newport County, 300,000 visitors annually. Built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, completed 1895, 70 rooms on 13 acres overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The Breakers survived because Vanderbilt family donated it to Preservation Society in 1948, recognized they couldn't maintain it privately, made pragmatic decision to preserve it as a museum rather than let it decay. Family retained living quarters on third floor until 2018, but ground floor was public museum since 1948. Revenue from admissions funded preservation. Hearst Castle, California, still standing. State of California operates it, about 750,000 visitors annually before COVID. Built by William Randolph Hearst, construction 1919 to 1947, never fully completed. 165 rooms on 250,000 acres. Hearst Castle survived because in 1957, Hearst Corporation donated it to State of California, became State Historic Park. Government assumed maintenance responsibility, admission fees fund operations with state budgets supplementing shortfalls. Pattern emerges. Surviving Gilded Age mansions shared characteristics Whitemarsh Hall lacked: family commitment across generations to adapt, conversion to revenue-generating operation, transfer to institution capable of sustaining costs, location that attracts sufficient tourism, unique features that justify preservation expense. Whitemarsh Hall failed on multiple criteria. Edward and Eva Stotesbury had no children together. Eva's children from her first marriage had no emotional attachment to the property that consumed her mother's fortune. No next generation existed to fight for preservation. The location, suburban Philadelphia, was neither remote enough to be romantic destination nor central enough to capture casual tourism. Asheville became tourist town partly because of Biltmore. Newport was already resort destination. San Simeon, Hearst Castle, was unique California coastal location. Whitemarsh Hall's location was just suburban, surrounded by development, no distinctive natural setting, accessible by car from Philadelphia, but not worth special trip. Whitemarsh's design, while magnificent, wasn't unique enough. It was another Beaux-Arts mansion, beautiful, expensive, but architecturally similar to dozens of others from same era. No distinctive features that made it irreplaceable. Biltmore had its setting in Blue Ridge Mountains. The Breakers had ocean views. Hearst Castle had Hearst's eccentric art collection and California coastal drama. Whitemarsh Hall had suburban Pennsylvania, and Eva Stotesbury's parties, which by definition couldn't be preserved because they were events, not architecture. Most critically, Whitemarsh Hall was built purely for display. No working farm, no forestry experiments, no unique collections, just house designed to impress people at parties. When parties stopped being socially acceptable, building lost its purpose. It had no secondary function, no adaptation potential, just massive structure that consumed resources without generating value. This is what makes Whitemarsh Hall perfect symbol of the Gilded Age excess. It was a monument to consumption without purpose, display without substance, expense without utility. And America demolished it without significant protest because deep down we knew it deserved demolition. Chapter 11. The Psychology of Excess. Edward and Eva Stotesbury weren't stupid. They weren't irrational. They were products of system that made building Whitemarsh Hall logical. Let's understand the psychology. Edward's calculation. He was senior partner at Drexel, connected to J.P. Morgan Empire. Wealth wasn't just personal asset, it was a tool, signal, performance. In Gilded Age banking, perceived stability mattered as much as actual capital. Bank run could destroy institution regardless of actual solvency. Confidence was currency. Whitemarsh Hall signaled confidence. A banker who could spend $83 million on a house clearly had resources, clearly was secure, clearly could be trusted with your capital. The mansion was business expense disguised as personal residence. Every party networked with wealthy clients. Every weekend house guest was a potential deal. Every society page mention reinforced brand. Edward calculated, correctly for while it lasted, that return on investment justified cost. Deals closed at Whitemarsh parties generated revenues that exceeded operating expenses. Eva's calculation, she was more complex, not just a gold digger, though she definitely married for security. She was a woman navigating society that gave her few paths to significance. In 1912, women couldn't vote, couldn't hold most professional positions, were expected to derive identity from their husband's achievements and their own social performance. Eva had been a widow without resources, had gambled and lost, had faced social irrelevance. Marrying Stotesbury gave her a second chance, but not security. Many wealthy widows existed in comfortable obscurity. Eva wanted more, wanted to matter, wanted name remembered. Building Whitemarsh Hall was her equivalent of building a business empire or writing an important book. It was achievement available to a wealthy woman in an era that offered few others. She wasn't naive about the costs. She understood numbers, but calculated, incorrectly as it turned out, that the Stotesbury fortune was infinite, that resources would always exceed expenses. The system psychology. Both calculations were enabled by an economic system that seemed to validate excess. Between 1890 and 1929, great American fortunes grew exponentially. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, DuPont, Vanderbilts, Morgans. Wealth concentrated at the top at a rate unprecedented in human history. The location, suburban Philadelphia, was neither remote enough to be romantic destination nor central enough to capture casual tourism. Asheville became tourist town partly because of Biltmore. Newport was already resort destination. San Simeon, Hearst Castle, was unique California coastal location. Whitemarsh Hall's location was just suburban, surrounded by development, no distinctive natural setting, accessible by car from Philadelphia, but not worth special trip. Whitemarsh's design, while magnificent, wasn't unique enough. It was another Beaux-Arts mansion, beautiful, expensive, but architecturally similar to dozens of others from same era. No distinctive features that made it irreplaceable. Biltmore had its setting in Blue Ridge Mountains. The Breakers had ocean views. Hearst Castle had Hearst's eccentric art collection and California coastal drama. Whitemarsh Hall had suburban Pennsylvania, and Eva Stotesbury's parties, which by definition couldn't be preserved because they were events, not architecture. Most critically, Whitemarsh Hall was built purely for display. No working farm, no forestry experiments, no unique collections, just house designed to impress people at parties. When parties stopped being socially acceptable, building lost its purpose. It had no secondary function, no adaptation potential, just massive structure that consumed resources without generating value. This is what makes Whitemarsh Hall perfect symbol of the Gilded Age excess. It was a monument to consumption without purpose, display without substance, expense without utility. And America demolished it without significant protest because deep down we knew it deserved demolition. Chapter 11. The Psychology of Excess. Edward and Eva Stotesbury weren't stupid. They weren't irrational. They were products of system that made building Whitemarsh Hall logical. Let's understand the psychology. Edward's calculation. He was senior partner at Drexel, connected to J.P. Morgan Empire. Wealth wasn't just personal asset, it was a tool, signal, performance. In Gilded Age banking, perceived stability mattered as much as actual capital. Bank run could destroy institution regardless of actual solvency. Confidence was currency. Whitemarsh Hall signaled confidence. A banker who could spend $83 million on a house clearly had resources, clearly was secure, clearly could be trusted with your capital. The mansion was business expense disguised as personal residence. Every party networked with wealthy clients. Every weekend house guest was a potential deal. Every society page mention reinforced brand. Edward calculated, correctly for while it lasted, that return on investment justified cost. Deals closed at Whitemarsh parties generated revenues that exceeded operating expenses. Eva's calculation, she was more complex, not just a gold digger, though she definitely married for security. She was a woman navigating society that gave her few paths to significance. In 1912, women couldn't vote, couldn't hold most professional positions, were expected to derive identity from their husband's achievements and their own social performance. Eva had been a widow without resources, had gambled and lost, had faced social irrelevance. Marrying Stotesbury gave her a second chance, but not security. Many wealthy widows existed in comfortable obscurity. Eva wanted more, wanted to matter, wanted name remembered. Building Whitemarsh Hall was her equivalent of building a business empire or writing an important book. It was achievement available to a wealthy woman in an era that offered few others. She wasn't naive about the costs. She understood numbers, but calculated, incorrectly as it turned out, that the Stotesbury fortune was infinite, that resources would always exceed expenses. The system psychology. Both calculations were enabled by an economic system that seemed to validate excess. Between 1890 and 1929, great American fortunes grew exponentially. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Mellon, DuPont, Vanderbilts, Morgans. Wealth concentrated at the top at a rate unprecedented in human history. These families looked around and saw no limits. Market crashes happened, 1893, 1907, but always recovered. Fortunes might temporarily shrink, but always grew back larger. They believed genuinely that wealth would compound forever, that industrial capitalism had created permanent prosperity machine for those positioned correctly. Building massive estates made sense in that context. If your fortune grows 15% annually, as many did during boom years, then spending 1% on mansion is sustainable luxury, like person earning $100,000 annually spending $1,000 on vacation. The math worked until it didn't. The fatal flaw. The Gilded Age excess rested on assumption that wealth was infinite, or at minimum, infinitely renewable. Mansions like Whitemarsh Hall were built with assumption they'd be maintained by ever-growing fortunes, that each generation would be richer than previous, that economic expansion was permanent condition. Nobody planned for depression, for sustained contraction, for the possibility that fortune could shrink faster than expenses could be reduced. And certainly nobody planned for social revolution that would make extreme wealth socially unacceptable, for income taxes and estate taxes that would make accumulating Stotesbury-level fortune nearly impossible, for cultural shift that valued modesty over ostentation. Whitemarsh Hall was built for a world that died in 1929. It lingered 51 more years as architectural zombie, beautiful corpse slowly decaying because nobody wanted to formally acknowledge it was dead. The demolition in 1980 was just making official what had been true since 1929. Whitemarsh Hall's world had ended. The building just took half-century to finish collapsing. Chapter 12. The Cost of Pretending. Let's do math that Eva Stotesbury should have done in 1916. Construction cost $83 million in 1921 dollars. Adjusted for inflation to 2024, approximately $1.3 billion. Annual operating cost, $1 million in 1920s dollars. Adjusted for inflation to 2024, approximately $16 million per year. Return on investment, 0. Whitemarsh Hall generated no revenue, 0. It was pure consumption. For this to be sustainable, you need initial wealth sufficient that $83 million construction doesn't significantly impair capital, investment returns that generate $1 million plus annually after other expenses, succession plan ensuring next generation maintains commitment, and economic system that allows such concentration of wealth. Edward Stotesbury had number 1 and number 2, barely. His fortune was large enough that $83 million was survivable hit, and his Drexel partnership generated income exceeding Whitemarsh costs. But he never secured number 3. No children with Eva. Eva's children from her first marriage had no stake. No succession plan existed beyond hope that Eva would find a buyer after his death. And number 4 evaporated with the Great Depression and subsequent tax reforms. The true cost. But financial cost isn't the darkest part. Let's examine what Whitemarsh Hall actually cost. Edward's later years, instead of comfortable retirement, spent final decade watching fortune shrink while maintaining a palace he couldn't use. Died knowing his wealth would be consumed maintaining properties after his death.
Eva's dignity. Spent years after Edward's death desperately trying to sell palace for any price. Accepted $167,000, humiliating loss, because alternative was bankruptcy. Died knowing her masterpiece became chemical laboratory, then abandoned ruin. Opportunity cost. $83 million in 1921 could have built 4,150 houses for working families at $20,000 each, funded university endowment generating millions annually for scholarships, created hospitals serving Philadelphia region in perpetuity, established foundation that would still exist today. Instead, it built palace that lasted 59 years, then became townhouses. Social cost. Whitemarsh Hall represented wealth extracted from American economy through financial mechanisms that benefited a tiny elite. That $83 million came from somewhere. From workers paid less than value they produced, from customers charged more than competitive rates, from financial engineering that concentrated wealth upward. Stotesbury wasn't a robber baron in direct sense, but Drexel and Company facilitated industrial consolidation that reduced competition and suppressed wages. It underwrote monopolies. It profited from a system that made few extremely rich while keeping many poor. Whitemarsh Hall was monument to that system, physical manifestation of wealth extracted from millions and concentrated in the hands of one couple who used it to throw parties. Environmental cost. 300 acres of Pennsylvania landscape converted to ornamental gardens requiring 70 gardeners and massive water and chemical inputs. Old-growth trees cleared, wetlands drained, natural ecosystem destroyed to create an artificial paradise that existed 59 years, then was abandoned. Today, those 300 acres are suburban development, but the original ecosystem is gone forever, replaced first by Eva's gardens, now by lawns and driveways and houses. Cultural cost. Whitemarsh Hall created a standard of excess that warped expectations for an entire generation. When wealthiest families build 100-room palaces, merely rich feel inadequate with 20 rooms. When parties cost $50,000, $5,000 seems modest. It fed an arms race of consumption that made enough an obsolete concept. If Stotesbury's need 147 rooms, how many do we need to be respectable? If they spend $1 million annually, what's appropriate for us? This psychology, measuring worth by scale of consumption, became embedded in American culture. We're still fighting it. Today, those 300 acres are suburban development, but the original ecosystem is gone forever, replaced first by Eva's gardens, now by lawns and driveways and houses. Historical cost. Whitemarsh Hall should be museum today, should be teaching tool, should be preserved so future generations can see physical manifestation of Gilded Age excess. Instead, it's townhouses, and most Americans have never heard of Whitemarsh Hall. The lesson it could teach is lost. When we add all costs, Whitemarsh Hall was catastrophically expensive, not just financially, but morally, socially, culturally, environmentally, historically. And that's before considering the most devastating cost, the human capital. Thousands of workers spent years building it. Thousands more spent years maintaining it. All that labor, all that skill, all that human lifetime spent creating and sustaining monument to a couple's ego. What else could those workers have built?
What could they have created if their labor had been directed towards something productive rather than purely ornamental? We'll never know, because they built Whitemarsh Hall instead, and 59 years later, wrecking crews demolished everything they'd created. All that human effort, all that skilled craftsmanship, all those thousands of hours, reduced to rubble for nothing. Chapter 13. The question nobody asks. Here's a question that makes preservationists uncomfortable. Should Whitemarsh Hall have been demolished? Yes, obviously yes. And that's what makes it tragic. Listen to preservation argument. Whitemarsh Hall was architectural masterpiece, Horace Trumbauer's finest work, representative of Gilded Age at peak, part of American architectural heritage, should have been saved for future generations. All true and all irrelevant, because preserving Whitemarsh Hall would have required $30 to $50 million for restoration, $1980, $1 to $2 million annually for maintenance, ongoing commitment for decades, public or private institution willing to assume responsibility. Nobody volunteered those resources, and nobody should have. Let's be honest about what preserving Whitemarsh Hall would have meant. Scenario 1, private owner. Who buys it? Someone extremely wealthy who wants a 147-room house in suburban Pennsylvania? That person doesn't exist. And if they did, why should society celebrate them spending tens of millions to live in palace while millions lack basic housing? Preserving Whitemarsh Hall for private residential use would mean perpetuating exactly the inequality that made its construction morally questionable originally. Scenario 2, museum. Pennsylvania or federal government could have acquired it, operated as a museum like they do with Vanderbilt mansions. But at what cost? Millions in restoration, millions annually in maintenance. Would enough people visit to justify expense? Would touring yet another Gilded Age mansion educate the public or just glamorize inequality? And who pays? If government funds it, that's taxpayer money that could fund schools, infrastructure, healthcare. Is touring Eva Stotesbury's palace worth diverting resources from actual public needs? Scenario 3, institutional use. Convert to college, hospital, government offices. Theoretically possible, but renovation costs would exceed building modern equivalent, and 147-room mansion is terrible layout for any institutional purpose. You'd spend massive sums adapting a building that was designed specifically to be inefficient palace. Why not build appropriate structure instead? The uncomfortable truth. Whitemarsh Hall should have been demolished because no sustainable use existed, private residence, morally wrong, museum, economically questionable, institution, practically impossible. Preservation cost exceeded value, tens of millions to restore monument to excess while real needs go unmet. That's not conservation, that's fetishizing inequality. Location made tourism unsustainable, not remote destination like Hearst Castle, not resort town like Newport, just suburban Philadelphia. Insufficient visitors to justify costs. Building had no unique features. Beautiful, yes, but architecturally similar to other preserved mansions. Didn't justify preservation priority. Demolition freed resources. Land was valuable. Townhouses housed 163 families. That's tangible social benefit. More benefit than maintaining an empty palace. This is hard for preservationists to accept. We're trained to believe all historic architecture deserves preservation. But resources are finite. Choices must be made. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the right choice is demolition. Whitemarsh Hall was one of those cases.
The real tragedy. The tragedy isn't that we demolished it. The tragedy is that we built it. We created a system that allowed one couple to spend $83 million on house while millions lived in poverty, that treated such excess as admirable rather than obscene.
We built economy that concentrated wealth so extremely that Whitemarsh Hall seemed reasonable. And then, when system collapsed and consequences arrived, we destroyed the evidence and pretended it had all been aberration, rather than logical outcome of economic structure we'd endorsed. Demolishing Whitemarsh Hall wasn't mistake, it was admission. Admission that we'd built a monument to values we could no longer defend, to a system we could no longer sustain, to a vision of America we no longer wanted to be. Smashing it with wrecking balls was easier than asking why we'd built it in first place. Chapter 14. The Modern Echo. You might think we learned a lesson from Whitemarsh Hall, that we recognized danger of unsustainable excess, that we built differently. You'd be wrong. The modern equivalents. Mega mansions. Today's wealthy build houses that dwarf even Whitemarsh Hall square footage, 30,000 to 100,000 square foot residences in Los Angeles, Florida, Texas, owned by tech billionaires, hedge fund managers, entertainment moguls. One gigantic LA mansion, 105,000 square feet, bowling alley, 4-lane bowling alley, 30-car garage, nightclub, multiple pools, IMAX theater, listed for $295 million, sat unsold for years, eventually sold for $126 million, a 57% loss. Sound familiar? The one in Bel Air, 100,000 square feet, 20 bedrooms, built on spec, meaning developer gambled someone would buy it, originally listed for $500 million, sold at auction for $126 million, another massive loss because, surprise, market for $500 million houses is approximately zero. Billionaire compounds, not single house, but multiple structures spread across hundreds of acres. Bill Gates' Medina, Washington estate, Larry Ellison's properties, Oprah's Montecito compound. Each cost tens of millions, require armies of staff, consume resources wildly out of proportion to actual use. These aren't homes, they're statements, just like Whitemarsh Hall. The economics still don't work. Just like Whitemarsh Hall, these properties are disasters waiting to happen. Built for specific owner's vision, unsellable to others. Operating costs exceed any reasonable return. No succession plan beyond hope someone wants the liability. Vulnerable to economic downturn or tax changes. History repeating because we haven't learned fundamental lesson. You cannot build sustainably for pure display. You cannot maintain palace-scale property on private fortune alone. You cannot create architecture of excess without eventually facing consequences. The difference: modern mega-mansions have one advantage Whitemarsh Hall lacked. They can be subdivided. When a billionaire goes bankrupt or dies, a massive compound can be broken into smaller luxury lots, individual structures sold separately, land subdivided and redeveloped. But that's not preservation, that's just admission that the original vision was unsustainable, that building at that scale was a mistake, that size exceeded function so dramatically that only solution is demolition disguised as division. We're building tomorrow's ruins. Future generations will look at photos of today's mega mansions the way we look at Whitemarsh Hall photographs. Why did they build so big? What were they thinking? The cultural parallel. Just like the Gilded Age, we live in an era of extreme wealth concentration. The top 1% own more than the bottom 90%. Billionaires multiply while median wages stagnate. And just like the Gilded Age, we celebrate excess. Instagram and YouTube document luxury. Millions watch celebrity house tour videos. We've made entertainment out of inequality. Eva Stotesbury's Parties in Society pages. Today's billionaire luxury on social media. Different medium, same message. Excess is aspirational. Until it's not. Until the economy crashes or cultural values shift or climate crisis makes resource waste undefensible. And then we'll demolish our mega mansions just like we demolished Whitemarsh Hall. We'll sell the rubble, build subdivisions, pretend it never happened. The pattern. America has amnesia about excess. We build unsustainably, crash, condemn previous generations' greed, then build unsustainably again once we've forgotten why previous generation crashed. Gilded Age ended in Great Depression. We condemned robber barons, instituted regulations, implemented progressive taxation. Then, gradually, starting around 1980, unwound those protections, cut taxes on wealthy, removed regulations, celebrated billionaires, called it job creation and economic freedom. And here we are again, building palaces, concentrating wealth, celebrating excess, pretending resources are infinite and consequences are theoretical. Whitemarsh Hall tried to warn us. We demolished the evidence instead of learning the lesson. Chapter 15. The Columns That Remain. Today, if you drive to corner of Douglas Road and East Willow Grove Avenue in Wyndmoor, Pennsylvania, you'll see them. 4 limestone columns, 50 feet tall, holding up nothing. They stand in median of street that cuts through what used to be Whitemarsh Hall's entrance drive. Townhouses surround them, cars pass on both sides, pedestrians mostly ignore them. There's a small plaque, mentions Whitemarsh Hall, notes it was one of America's largest private residences, demolished 1980. That's it. That's the memorial. 4 columns and a plaque explaining what used to be here. Most people walking past don't read plaque, don't know what columns represent. They're just decorative elements in a subdivision, architectural ornament giving historic character to the development. Perfect metaphor. We kept the ornamental parts, the 4 impressive columns that photograph well. We demolished everything else, and we turned the site into profitable real estate. Preservation as performance. Keep enough fragments to claim we care about history, destroy the actual substance, profit from what remains. The Gatehouse. About quarter-mile from columns stands original gatehouse, small building where staff once controlled access to the estate. Vehicles and visitors had to pass inspection before proceeding up Main Drive. Today, it's single-family home, renovated, expanded, lived in by family who probably have no connection to the Stotesburys. It's nice that Gatehouse survives, but it's also meaningless. Gatehouse without the estate it guarded is like keeping single page from a destroyed book. Fragment survives, but the context, the thing that gave it meaning, is gone. The Belvedere. One garden structure remains, a belvedere that once offered views across 300 acres of curated landscape. From it, guests could see formal gardens transitioning to English parkland, could observe terraces and fountains and statuary, could appreciate the scale of Eva's vision. Today, it sits in a subdivision, surrounded by townhouses and driveways and privacy fences. The views are gone, context obliterated. It's just old structure in a neighborhood, maintained barely because removing it would cost more than leaving it. The headless statues. Few classical statues survived, marble figures that once lined garden paths, decapitated by vandals in 1970s when Mansion was abandoned. They stand in odd locations now, one in front of a townhouse, another in a common area, headless bodies frozen in classical poses, gazing with non-existent eyes at a world that replaced the one they were meant to decorate. Perfect metaphor again. We literally decapitated the monuments, destroyed the identity, kept broken bodies as ornament. What they tell us? These fragments, columns, gatehouse, belvedere, headless statues, are deliberately inadequate preservation. We kept enough to claim we saved something, not enough to actually preserve history, not enough to teach meaningful lesson, not enough to prevent same mistakes. It's preservation as alibi. See, we kept the columns, we care about history, while building subdivision that profits from erasing that history. And it works, because most people don't know what was lost. They see columns and think, neat historic element. don't realize those columns marked entrance to one of America's largest private residences, don't know about Eva's parties or Edward's fortune or the $83 million palace that stood here 50 years ago. The fragments are lies by omission. They testify that something important existed, but hide what it actually was, and definitely don't explain why it was demolished. If we wanted honest preservation, plaque would read, Whitemarsh Hall, 1921 to 1980, built by banker Edward Stotesbury and wife Eva for $83 million, required $1 million annually to operate, used for parties and social display. Eva tried to sell after Edward's death in 1938. No buyers at any price. Eventually sold for $167,000, 99.8% loss. Used as laboratory, abandoned, vandalized, demolished, replaced by townhouses. These columns and broken statues are all that remains of palace that proved American excess is unsustainable. But that plaque would force uncomfortable questions, would make visitors think about wealth inequality, about sustainability, about whether celebrating Gilded Age palaces is actually celebrating something shameful. So we get sanitized plaque, historical facts without moral weight, preservation without education, and most people walk past without learning anything except there used to be big house here. Chapter 16, The Lesson We Won't Learn. Whitemarsh Hall teaches crystal clear lesson. We refuse to learn it. The lesson. Building beyond sustainable capacity for display purposes is guaranteed path to failure. Sooner or later, resources cannot meet consumption. Sooner or later, structure becomes a liability. Sooner or later, demolition is only practical option. You cannot maintain a palace on private fortune alone unless fortune is literally infinite, and fortunes are never infinite. Markets crash, tax laws change, heirs lose interest. Something always goes wrong. This is mathematical certainty, not opinion, not moral judgment, just math. If operating costs exceed sustainable income, property cannot survive long term. If property generates no revenue and requires massive expense, it will eventually be abandoned or demolished. Whitemarsh Hall proved this equation, as have hundreds of other Gilded Age mansions demolished across America, as will dozens of current mega mansions built by today's billionaires. Why we won't learn. We won't learn because learning would require admitting things we don't want to admit. Number 1, extreme wealth concentration is unstable. If Stotesbury's $100 million fortune couldn't sustain Whitemarsh Hall permanently, what does that say about sustainability of current billionaire wealth? About systems that allow single individuals to accumulate billions while millions lack basic security? Number 2, display for its own sake is waste. Whitemarsh Hall had no purpose beyond impressing people. That made it useless when cultural values shifted. How much of our modern economy is equally useless? How much luxury consumption serves only display rather than actual utility? 3. What the wealthy call success is often just delayed failure. Edward Stotesbury was considered successful, one of America's richest men, yet his greatest architectural achievement lasted 59 years, then was demolished at massive loss. What does that say about how we measure success? 4. Individual accumulation ultimately serves no one. All that wealth, all that beauty, all those resources, where did it go? Into building that was demolished, leaving nothing but fragments and photographs. What did society gain from Stotesbury accumulating $100 million except eventual burden of demolishing palace he built? We're repeating same pattern right now. Today's billionaires are building mansions and buying yachts and launching vanity space programs while infrastructure crumbles and housing crisis worsens. We're heading toward another reckoning, another crash, another wave of demolitions. These admissions are uncomfortable. They challenge fundamental American mythology about wealth creation, about earning fortunes, about celebrating success. So we don't admit them. We demolish the evidence instead. We turn palaces into subdivisions. We keep a few columns and write sanitized plaques. And we start building again. The real memorial. Proper memorial to Whitemarsh Hall wouldn't be columns, it would be policy. Wealth taxes that prevent accumulation, requiring palace-scale display, regulations on residential construction limiting waste, cultural shift away from celebrating extreme consumption, economic system where resources flow towards sustainable housing rather than display property. But that would require admitting Whitemarsh Hall represented system failure, not individual excess, would require acknowledging our own complicity in celebrating wealth inequality. Easier to leave 4 columns standing and forget why palace they once supported was demolished. Chapter 17. The Final Accounting. Let's do final accounting on Whitemarsh Hall, a complete balance sheet of American greed. Costs, financial. Construction, $83 million, 1921 dollars, approximately $1.3 billion today. Operating, $1 million annually times 59 years equals $59 million, approximately $940 million today. Total, $142 million, approximately $2.24 billion in 2024 dollars. Human, thousands of workers spent years building it, hundreds spent years maintaining it, all that labor extracted from productive economy to create pure display, hours that could have built hospitals, schools, affordable housing. Environmental. 300 acres converted from natural ecosystem to ornamental gardens, massive resource consumption for construction, ongoing consumption for maintenance, all destroyed when the property was abandoned. Opportunity. $142 million could have funded 7,100 houses at $20,000 each, 1920s prices. University endowment still generating millions today. Multiple hospitals serving millions of patients. Infrastructure benefiting entire region. Social. Normalized extreme inequality, created consumption arms race among wealthy, provided moral cover for other excesses, warped expectations of what constitutes enough. Returns. For Edward Stotesbury, social prestige during lifetime, business networking opportunities, personal satisfaction, maybe. Died worrying about finances despite a $100 million fortune. For Eva Stotesbury, social acceptance for 18 years, 1912 to 1930, famous parties documented in society pages, sense of accomplishment, died humiliated by having to sell palace for 0.2% of cost. For society, some employment during construction, temporary storage for museum art during World War II, architectural photographs and drawings, object lesson we immediately forgot. For residents of subdivisions, 163 families now live on property, townhouses selling for $400,000, possibly worse deal than if land had been developed sensibly from the start. Net result. $2.24 billion in resources consumed to create 59 years of parties, followed by 12 years of abandonment, followed by demolition. All that's left, 4 columns, 1 gatehouse, 1 belvedere, some headless statues, and photographs of something that used to exist. This is not success story. This is not triumph of American capitalism. This is not validation of wealth can do anything philosophy. This is pure waste. Resources consumed, labor exploited, opportunities missed, environment damaged. For what? So Edward and Eva Stotesbury could feel important for a couple decades before economic reality demolished their palace as surely as wrecking balls demolished its stone. The verdict. Whitemarsh Hall was mistake from conception. Building it was an error. Maintaining it was folly. Demolishing it was inevitable. Only question is why we keep making same mistake. Why today's billionaires build unsustainable palaces. Why we celebrate wealth accumulation that ultimately serves no one. The answer is simple. Because we learn nothing from history we've demolished.
Chapter 18. The Truth About Forgetting. Why don't more people know about Whitemarsh Hall? Why isn't it taught alongside Wyndmoor and Hearst Castle as defining Gilded Age mansions? Why have we forgotten Palace that was third largest private residence in American history? Because we choose to forget. Selective memory. We remember Wyndmoor, we remember the breakers, we remember Hearst Castle. These survived, became museums, tourist attractions, success stories of sort. We've turned them into validation of Gilded Age. Look at beautiful architecture they created. Look at the craftsmanship. Look at the art collections. We don't emphasize that even these successes required conversion to public museums because families couldn't maintain them privately. We definitely don't emphasize hundreds of other Gilded Age mansions that were demolished because no solution existed. Whitemarsh Hall represents inconvenient truth, so we forget it. Uncomfortable questions. Remembering Whitemarsh Hall means asking, why did we allow a system where one couple could spend $83 million on a house? What does it say about our values that we demolished rather than preserved it? Are we creating same unsustainable structures today? What will we demolish 50 years from now while pretending we learned something this time? These questions challenge American mythology, suggest system might be flawed, that wealth concentration might not be admirable, that maybe celebrating billionaires is a mistake. Easier to forget Whitemarsh Hall ever existed. The narratives we prefer. America loves redemption stories, preservation triumphs, adaptive reuse successes. Wyndmoor fits that narrative. Family adapted, open to public, created a sustainable business. Everybody wins. Whitemarsh Hall doesn't fit. There's no redemption, just waste, demolition, forgetting. That's not story Americans want to hear. So we erase it. We leave 4 columns standing. We build townhouses. We move on. The danger of forgetting. But forgetting guarantees repetition. If we don't remember why Whitemarsh Hall failed, we can't avoid building the next Whitemarsh Hall. And we are building them right now. Mega mansions that will be tomorrow's ruins, wealth concentration that will lead to tomorrow's crash, excess that will require tomorrow's demolition. Because we forgot last time, so we're repeating same mistakes with same confidence, building unsustainably, celebrating inequality, pretending this time is different. What remembering would require. Actually remembering Whitemarsh Hall, teaching it in schools, including it in architectural tours, discussing it honestly, would require admitting Gilded Age wasn't just beautiful architecture, it was systemic exploitation creating concentrated wealth used for display while millions suffered. Mansion preservation is a complex moral question, not a simple historical imperative. Sometimes demolition is the right choice.
We haven't solved the problems that created Whitemarsh Hall. We're recreating them under different branding. Celebrating billionaires is celebrating the same system that built Whitemarsh Hall. If we condemn the palace, we should question the system that enabled it.
That's why we forget. Not because Whitemarsh Hall isn't important, because it's too important, too revealing, too inconvenient. The irony: Eva Stotesbury built Whitemarsh Hall to be remembered, to establish family name alongside Vanderbilts and Astors, to create lasting monument to Stotesbury achievement. She succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. She built third largest private residence in American history, hosted French prime ministers, made society pages for 2 decades. And 50 years after her death, almost nobody knows her name. Most Americans have never heard of Whitemarsh Hall. When they have, it's as a cautionary tale of excess and demolition. Eva wanted to be remembered for greatness. She's forgotten except as example of waste. Perfect justice, poetic irony, complete failure of her actual goal despite technical success of her method. You can't build permanent legacy on foundation of temporary excess. You can't achieve immortality through architecture of unsustainable display. Eva learned that too late. We still haven't learned it all. Epilogue: The columns' silence. It's winter evening in Wyndmoor, Pennsylvania. 4 limestone columns stand in street median. Snow is falling, streetlights cast long shadows, cars pass on both sides, headlights sweep across carved stone that once marked entrance to a palace. Nobody stops. Nobody reads plaque. Nobody knows this was once Whitemarsh Hall. Townhouses surrounding columns are warm. Families inside watch TV, make dinner, help kids with homework, living normal suburban lives, completely unaware their homes sit on ground where Eva Stotesbury hosted French prime ministers and Edward Stotesbury made banking deals worth millions. History is silent here. Present has overwritten past so completely that only physical fragments hint something else once existed. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe Whitemarsh Hall doesn't deserve remembrance. Maybe it was mistake that deserved forgetting. Maybe the best thing we could do with palace built on inequality was destroy it and build homes for normal families. Or maybe we're losing something irreplaceable by forgetting. Not the palace itself, that deserved demolition, but the lesson it taught, the warning it embodied, the example it provided of what happens when excess exceeds sustainability. Because we're building new Whitemarsh Halls right now, different forms, same function, same trajectory toward demolition and forgetting. The columns stand silent, holding up nothing, marking entrance to a place that doesn't exist, memorial to ambition that exceeded resources and vision that outpaced sustainability. They could teach us something if we'd listen, if we'd remember, if we'd learn. But we won't, because learning would require changing, and changing would require admitting current system leads to the same outcomes as old system. Easier to walk past columns without reading plaque, easier to forget Whitemarsh Hall existed, easier to believe this time is different, until it isn't, until today's mega mansions become tomorrow's subdivisions, until current billionaires become cautionary tales, until someone in 2080 writes an article asking why nobody remembers the estate that Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk built. And the cycle continues. Build, crash, demolish, forget, repeat. The columns witness it all, silent, patient, holding up nothing, just like they were meant to hold up a palace that couldn't sustain itself. Perfect symbol after all. The final truth. Whitemarsh Hall defined American greed not through its construction, but through its demolition. Building massive palaces shows ambition.
Lots of civilizations built palaces. Versailles, Forbidden City, Palace of Westminster, Schönbrunn. Grand architectural statements exist everywhere. But demolishing your palaces after 59 years, that's distinctly American. We build bigger than anyone, and we destroy faster than anyone. We create monuments and call them disposable. We construct for centuries and demolish after decades. This is our signature. This is what defines us. Not the architecture we create, but how quickly we destroy it when maintenance becomes inconvenient. Whitemarsh Hall could have been preserved with effort, with money, with commitment. Other nations preserve their architectural heritage across centuries. Stone buildings in Europe that are 1,000 years old, Japanese temples that have been maintained for 15 centuries, Middle Eastern structures that predate Christianity. We demolished Whitemarsh Hall after 59 years because maintaining it was expensive and we value convenience over heritage. That's what defines American greed. Not building palace, but building it knowing we won't maintain it. Extracting resources from economy to create something beautiful, then destroying it rather than sustaining it. Privatizing profits during construction, socializing costs during demolition. And forgetting it ever happened, because remembering would require asking uncomfortable questions about whether we're doing same thing right now. The columns stand as monument not to Whitemarsh Hall's construction, but to our willingness to destroy what we cannot sustain, and our determination to forget we ever built it. That's the legacy of Whitemarsh Hall. That's the forgotten mansion that defined American greed, not by existing, but by being forgotten.
Final reflection. If you ever drive through Wyndmoor, Pennsylvania, look for 4 columns at corner of Douglas Road and East Willow Grove Avenue. Stop. Read plaque. Think about what used to stand there. Think about Edward and Eva Stotesbury, about $83 million palace that lasted 59 years. About waste of resources and waste opportunity and waste of human potential. Think about whether we've learned anything, whether today's mega mansions and billionaire compounds represent progress or repetition, whether celebrating extreme wealth is somehow different now than it was in 1920. Think about what we choose to preserve versus what we choose to demolish. What that says about our values, about what we actually care about once maintaining it becomes expensive. And ask yourself, in 100 years, what will we wish we'd preserved? What are we demolishing right now, literally or metaphorically, that future generations will condemn us for destroying? Because Whitemarsh Hall tried to warn us. We demolished the warning instead of heeding it. And somewhere, Eva Stotesbury's ghost is laughing because she spent fortune building palace that would make her immortal, and she achieved something better. She built cautionary tale so perfect that we forgot it rather than learn from it. That's more lasting than any palace. That's more defining than any achievement. That's American greed in its purest form, the ability to waste magnificently and forget completely. Welcome to Whitemarsh Hall, the palace nobody remembers, the lesson nobody learned, the greed nobody acknowledged, the future nobody sees coming. Again.